This is going to be one of 4 presentations that we have today for you. But this one is really going to be focusing on an introduction to mangrove ecosystems. We're going to talk about what is a mangrove, mangroves worldwide, mangroves in Florida, ways to identify mangroves, our native species of mangroves here, and then ecosystem services as well as threats. So this is going to be a quick overview. There's plenty of people who dedicated their whole lives, PhDs, all sorts of stuff towards this topic. So I understand there's different variability of experience levels and information levels. Some people, this will be a complete review. Other people, you're going to learn a couple of fun facts from today. So once again, my name is Mike Sipos. I'm the IFAS Extension agent, Florida Sea Grant agent down here in Collier County. So what is a mangrove? A mangrove is a halophytic tree or shrub that lives in tropical and subtropical intertidal wetlands. And because of this sort of loose definition, there's about 100 to 110 mangrove species, but only about 40 to 50 true mangrove species. And they're adapted for living in these ever-changing environments. So there's a lot of variation between the species or even within the species. You know, some of them can be dwarfed, like that small red mangrove you can see on the left-hand side, or that large, it could be a giant mangroves that are found around the equator that you can see in like Panama. That's where you can see that right picture over there. They're distributed in 16 families and 20 genuses. But that true mangrove characteristic separating that 100 to 110 ones that are considered mangroves with air quotes there from the true ones, they have to have adaptations for salt tolerance. So either excluding or extruding salts. They have to have hypoxic tolerance, so be able to bring oxygen down to those roots which are getting inundated by tidal waters, and then they have to be reproduced via viviparity. So this is a live little propagule that's hanging off a tree. That's a germinated seed. So those are the characteristics of a true mangrove that separates them from other species like you might have heard of, like buttonwoods. So they're a great benefit for both humans and the environment out there. But another thing about them is that they live in these sort of tropical intertidal wetland areas, but they can live also in freshwater areas. But in those areas, they're outcompeted by larger kind of trees and other kind of species. So they're adapted to living in these really cool fringe environments. So mangrove ecosystems worldwide, they cover about 53,000 square miles, which is about 33.9 million acres. And they're found in these sheltered kind of coastlines. So not necessarily the beach, but more so bays, estuaries, back halves of barrier islands. And between 75% of all the mangrove biomass is located between 25 degrees north and 25 degrees south, which is actually outside of Florida's range. But 42% of all the mangroves found worldwide actually occur in Asia, which has like the highest amount of biodiversity out there. About 25% of that 42% or 25% of the total mangroves out there can be found in Indonesia. That has that, they have about 30 different species, while we have 3 species over here. So globally, they attribute to about 0.5% of the global coastline area, but they're really good at, creating canopies, wood, all sorts of stuff that does a lot of carbon capture. So a mangrove can shed about 3 tons of detritus or organic matter from their canopy every year. And that's about 1,400 pounds of carbon that's getting shed during that time. So about 10 to 15% of the world's carbon is captured in mangroves and mangrove ecosystems, but they're only about that 0.5% of the global coastline. So really important. And that decaying organic matter is actually the base of the food web. So the many marine and estuarine ecosystems rely on mangroves, either by providing that detritus, which starts the microbial process, which leads to mineralization of nutrients that can fuel algae and the base of the food web there, to protecting other kind of environments like seagrass beds, reducing that kind of surface erosion that could lead to sedimentation in the water, blocking out light. Same to be said for coral reefs and even upland systems, buffering that wave action. And there's over 3,000 species that are directly supported by mangroves worldwide. Many of those are just animals, because in areas where the mangroves live, they're super adapted to live in these salty kind of areas where other plants can't live. So they provide these monospecies thickets just sort of mangroves in those areas. But the plants, the animals, the invertebrates, the epiphytic invertebrates like those tunicates, sponges, bryozoans, shrimp, reptiles, amphibians, birds, all call mangroves their home. So those 3,000 species directly support about 120 million people worldwide. And yeah, so we'll go over mangroves in Florida. So in Florida, we have about 600,000 acres of mangrove wetlands, and about 573,000 of those acres are actually in conservation. Collier County has about 86,000 acres of mangroves, which is probably the highest density of mangroves in the state. Try to find it for Lee and Charlotte County, couldn't find those figures, but to give you an idea of how large 86,000 acres, you could fit 77 of all the Disney World parks combined in that space. So there's 3 native species of mangroves and 1 closely associated species. And there's the closely associated species is the buttonwood that lives around the mangroves, especially in the ones that are in the uplands kind of environment with the white mangrove. But they don't have any true adaptations to living in these low dissolved oxygen conditions. And they actually reproduce through a seed, which their buttonwood kind of name gets named after. It's like a little pine coney looking seed. But other than that, the other 3 species that are considered mangroves here are the red mangroves, which are going to be on the outer fringe, the black mangroves, and then the white mangroves. And there's a natural zonation of these mangroves depending on the topography of the area. If it's a gentler slope, some mangroves are sort of limited based on how their air breathing structures can reach out of the water. So red mangroves have these air prop roots that could reach all the way to the bottom, providing oxygen down to the bottom. They're covered in these air pores called lenticels. Black mangroves have these pneumatophores, which are only a couple inches to a foot tall. So they could be, the second most deepest mangrove, and then white mangroves develop these peg roots if they're in sort of wet kind of conditions, but more so you don't really see those present. And there's tons of ecosystem services out there. And an ecosystem service is basically indirect and direct benefits to humans. And historically, they're undervalued because we looked at the direct benefits to humans. Basically, what kind of forestry kind of products, things we can harvest from these mangroves, which they have way more value just being alive and standing there with nutrient kind of cycling, providing other species homes for hundreds of animals over here. There's about 2,500 arboreal arthropods that rely on mangroves, 300 species of aquatic invertebrates, 180 something species of birds, 200 species of fish, 24 or so mammals and reptiles out there. So a lot of those can be actually, protected as well, like the American crocodile, the indigo snake, the manatee, the sawfish, all call mangrove estuaries their homes. And then it was interesting doing a deep dive on this kind of stuff, because you'd see where researchers have sort of split the difference between figures, but there's a paper, Lewis et al. 1985, that really talks about how they impact the local fisheries in the area. And about 75% of the sport fishing species are reliant on mangroves in Southwest Florida, and about 90% of commercially harvested species rely on mangroves during some portion of their life. In Florida, they're protected by the Mangrove Trimming Preservation Act, which protects them from trimming, removing them from public lands, and then there's specific criteria that are needed for certified mangrove trimmers on private lands. And we always talk about sort of decreasing of range, but there's actually a slight range expansion of mangroves in Florida. Between 1984 to 2011 on the Atlantic coast, there's about 3,000 additional acres of mangroves that were found north of Palm Beach. And this is sort of that tropicalization kind of effect where it's getting warmer, less cold snaps are there, which allows that expansion of mangroves. Black mangroves are probably the most thermal tolerant ones, able to handle those big swings, while red mangroves you might find in other areas because they have that longer degree of propagule viability. So they're colonizers out there. So something to keep in mind. However, that range expansion might sound like a good thing, but it's also decreasing the amount of wetland environments out there, which are also very productive for us. So let's go into sort of species profile, how to identify our 3 native species of mangrove. First up to bat is the red mangrove. So they get their name from the reddish brown bark that you can find, especially on new growth. If you look at those aerial prop roots that you can see in that upper right corner, you'll see that reddish kind of bark. And they're very spongy too. And they're spongy because they have those small gas exchanging pores called lenticels, like I mentioned, that gets that air down to their root system. So that's that adaptation and a really easy way to identify those red mangroves. They get about 75 feet tall, but typically they're only about 20 foot. And that's because they're on the exterior fringe of these environments. So they're most exposed to that wind, the salt shear, the waves beating on them, which can batter them down a little bit. Maybe the more protective ones are the larger, the higher mangroves. So their adaptation for salt is they exclude salt, actually. So it's a membrane facilitated process where they prevent salt from even coming into them. And because of that, and because of where they're located, they're the least salt tolerant. They're on the fringe, so there's a lot of that tidal flushing. And they could live in up to 60 to 65 parts per thousand, which is almost twice as much as the salinity of salt water, typical Gulf water. But the other mangrove species are more adapted to higher degrees of salt tolerance, because when that water comes in with the tide and evaporates, it starts making these hypersaline pools that black and white mangroves can be exposed to. So another easy way to identify this mangrove is by these long propagules, cigar-shaped propagules. They're the largest ones. They have the longest propagule viability. They can float around the ocean for up to a year and still produce a plant. So definitely colonizer kind of species. They have these pointed leaves that are waxy on both sides and sort of the same-ish color. That resembles black mangroves, but you'll see the difference between the black mangrove leaves, where they're more minty on the bottom, where they excrete salt, and you can see that. But a rhyme that they have is red, pointy head, to identify the red mangroves. And we'll go over the other kind of rhymes for the other species. So next up, we got the black mangroves. Second, up on that zonation kind of scale. They're named after the dark heartwood that is on the interior of them. They're fringed, but more interior. They're really just sort of reliant on how deep that high tide is. So if the high tide goes way over their pneumatophores, they probably won't do so great. So they're not going to live in that kind of area. So they're going to be, they could all occur in the same place if the tide isn't as will bury these kind of structures that they need to breathe, either those lenticels, those prop roots, or these pneumatophores. But they get about 40 to 50 feet tall. They're salt extruders, so they actually bring in the salt and they excrete it through many different kind of functions, mostly through like the bottom of the leaves. They say black, salt on back. So if you lick the backside of the leaf, you'll taste some salt, and you can sort of see it building up on those leaves over there. And they're that minty color. They're the same kind of shape as red mangroves. That's that other characteristic to identify them as. Prop roots are probably the easiest, and then probably by their propagules, the third, which are about 1 to 2 inches in length. They're lima bean shaped, and they have about 110-day propagule viability. So less than the white mangrove. So their ability to expand is a little bit less with that floating kind of dispersal method. So next up to bat, we got the white mangroves. So they're found at the highest elevations of all 3 mangroves, although, like I said, all of them can be within feet of each other, which as an educator, that's super valuable, because you can point them out, like, this is how you identify this one, that one, that one. So their max height's about 30 to 40 feet tall. They're salt extruders as well, so they're bringing up that salt and excreting it. They're excreting it through, those glands that they have located on the outside of the mangrove leaves, as well as when they lose leaves, they lose barks, they lose sticks, they're shedding salt, they're shedding contaminants that they might be bringing up as well. So that's another form of salt removal. So their identification, there's not any visible like pneumatophores or breathing structures like those prop roots, but in wet environments, they develop peg roots, which are very hard to find online. And I'm not sure if I've even seen true peg roots. So I'll be looking for those. They have these two tight kind of glands right here, which I like to call Frankenstein bolts. So the rhyme for them is white, white, hold on tight. So these two little bolts are actually called nectaries. And what is a nectarine? That's a sugary fruit. So nectaries actually excrete some sort of a sugary substance, such they have a symbiosis with like different kind of bugs out there that could be pollinators, or they could attract bugs that could prevent, grazing by, having protection against herbivores out there. They have a round, shiny leaf, and they have like this like little butt shape kind of right there on the edge that you could tell. That's one way of identification. And then their oblong propagule is actually sort of inspired by their scientific name, which means little flask. They have the least amount of viability in terms of dispersal. They're only good for about 35 days. Yep, and produce white flowers. So ecosystem services, these are, what we mentioned before, but it's direct and indirect contributions to human well-being. So it could be broken down to provisioning, which is sort of production of oxygen, production of water, food, regulating, storm surge protection, disease control, like thermal protection, supporting different kind of chemical cycles out there, habitats for all these commercially and recreationally valuable species, and then cultural, which is ecotourism, sort of heritage kind of aspects of how important these mangroves are. So Conservation Collier put out a really good paper that sort of broken down 32 different environmental ecosystem services, and they put a value to them, which is great to put a value to something because it helps with decision making for regulations and what have you. And they found that 1 acre of mature mangroves was worth about $279,000 per year. And that was in 2013 money, which is about $361,000 in today's money. And they also found that with different studies that the value of mature mangroves is greater, and it's a non-linear relationship. So I mentioned, that carbon capture, a larger mangrove can capture more carbon, it can cycle more nutrients, it could absorb more of those environmental pollutants. And they found that, I read that a 5-foot tall mangrove acre versus a 35-foot tall mangrove acre, the value of the 35-foot tall mangrove acre is about 45.5 times as much. So, more of that uptake, more of that carbon sort of deposition, oxygen production, and everything really. But I'll show you some of these ecosystem services here. And I think some of the biggest ones out there would be erosion control, flood protection, soil formation, nutrient removal, pollination services, habitat, nursery environments, fisheries, support to fisheries, hunting, raw materials, ecotourism. About 1 in 7 jobs in Collier County is reliant on the tourism industry, and ecotourism is a huge aspect over here. Privacy screening, and they actually valued production of oxygen as being very high. And next to mangroves, the only other environments that are as not even as productive, but the second and third highest were tropical hardwoods and bays and estuaries, which mangroves definitely positively impact both of those environments. And to beat a dead horse, here's that wave flume of what a mangrove forest can do in terms of wave attenuation, decreasing that. And, they might have saved us from a lot of that hurricane damage to our physical structures out there. So next up, we got threats. So total, we've lost about 25% of our mangrove habitat in the last 50 years. And I've read somewhere that there's about 50% of mangrove loss since we've recorded mangrove loss, really. So there's human caused threats and environmental threats. The human caused threats can be development, farming, aquaculture, dredging, harvesting, pollution, herbicides. Like I saw a figure that was like in the Vietnam War, the U.S. military defoliated about 250,000 acres of mangroves. So, defoliation can be a stress on some mangrove species like red mangroves that they're not as great as recovering from like black mangroves that could maybe even start from a branch that doesn't even have any leaves. So that's one implication there. And then different threats can have similar effects. So like suffocation of the mangroves can be caused by clogging of these structures through hydrocarbons and pollutants covering it, from storms making sediment clog these structures and pneumatophores. Flooding can do that too. So there's different kind of aspects of the same kind of different stressors can have the same negative final result. And then expansion. So I talked a little bit about that tropicalization that's occurring in Florida, where mangroves are actually expanding in some areas, and then restoration. So we're doing a lot of restoration work because they are, negatively impacted by development. If there's a road that is built and maybe there's not as much tidal flushing and cause suffocation to mangroves that are inundated with water, that doesn't allow the water to recede back into its natural environment. So interestingly enough, in the past that there used to be a lot more human-caused kind of issues, but now it's sort of 50-50 human to natural caused issues. But in areas where there is a lot of development starting, like Indonesia, India, Brazil, Central America, where they're developing like rice farms, aquaculture facilities, they're taking out a lot of mangroves there. So globally, mangroves are on the decline. In the United States, they might be on the slight incline, but they are very valuable just for the whole world's marine ecosystems. So yeah, I left a little bit of time for people. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. We can answer some via the chat. If you scan that Linktree QR code, you can see where my social media pages are, blogs, other kind of resources I posted. And yeah, thanks for listening, guys.
Thanks, Mike. One of the questions that did come up while you were speaking, I'll give everybody a chance to type in any questions they may have at the end now, was somebody was interested in your what document you were referring to when you were talking about the valuation of mangrove services in Collier County. If you want to post the link for that in the chat, I think that could be helpful to folks.
Sure, I have it in PDF form. I'll try to find a link for that when other people are speaking, but it was really good. It did a whole breakdown of those 32 different factors and had paragraphs on each one, so you can see their thought process of how they valued each characteristic.
Cool. Thanks.
Okie dokie.
I'm not seeing a lot of other engagement, so I think we will just keep plugging on and try to get to any questions that anybody didn't get to ask later on in the presentation. Oh, here we go. We got one from Woody Woodworth. He said, what is the typical recovery time for mangroves, red especially following a hurricane?
I'll answer that, and if other people want to jump in as well, they definitely can. Well, everything's a spectrum. So, if there was mangroves that were defoliated and there was plenty of mangroves on the understory that weren't affected by the wind, maybe the recovery time's much faster. So, or what if a boat crashes through those mangroves? That's another kind of thing there. Total defoliation of red mangroves, I think that's very dim on recovery for those until maybe there might be new recruitment, or if there are some leaves left. With the black and white mangroves, I mentioned they could undergo that epicormic growth where you could see leaves just sort of poking out of bare sticks. So there's no real good way of saying it. Just depends on our mangrove damage assessment, which Alyssa is going to go into.
Yeah, we did have one question that's come in asking about debris removal and how that might impact the mangroves. And so we'll talk a little bit about that and as we go through, but let me go ahead and get my presentation shared here for you all.
And for those that have joined us, while Mike was speaking, we've put some information for interacting with us in the chat via the Jamboard and also the chat itself. And also one note that this, we are recording at the moment, so we plan to post a link to that later for your reference.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. And happy to talk to you today about mangrove damage assessment. And so, Mike did a great job of going over where we find mangroves, what species we have here, some of their ecosystem services, why they're important, why we care. I think a lot of us here in this meeting today are here because we know that mangroves are very important, and we're concerned about the damage we've seen recently. And so what I'm going to talk to you about is just kind of a brief overview of how we can use a few key indicators to help us plan for what kind of restoration might be necessary in different areas. And a lot of this is based off of a really good document that I will send out to everyone in a follow-up email. The Nature Conservancy put together a great mangrove damage assessment toolkit based on a lot of research from many different institutions. And so I'll be sharing that with you as well. So when we go out to assess the status of mangroves, mangrove fringes, shorelines, mangrove islands, we want to make sure that we have a kind of an idea of what we're looking at, right? And so we will look at 4 main categories when we go out to do our damage assessments: structure, hydrology, sediment, and topography. And so based on some of the things that we might observe in these different categories, we can make a decision about what kind of damage we're seeing. And so structure is going to refer to things like the height of the trees, what kinds of species are present. Are you dealing with a situation where you had all red mangroves and now they're all gone? Is there a loss of species complexity? Do you see young seedlings present? Do you have a lot of large branches broken? Have you lost all of your height? Those are the kinds of things that we put into the structure category. Hydrology means any change in the flow of water. So if you have sediment buildup, this can add to salinization of the soil, right? New channels being cut through. If you have a boat to plow through your mangroves, you may have provided access to some of those depressional marshes that kind of build up behind our red mangrove fringes sometimes. So changes in that hydrology are things that we need to look for. Sediment, again, pollution buildup. This is a large concern where you have a lot of human pollution that is swept out from onshore. So we have upland debris that gets washed out into the water and ends up in our mangroves. Things like paint cans, gasoline, different kinds of chemicals from boats. If there's any kind of manufacturing facilities nearby, anything like that that gets into the water can contribute to that pollution buildup in the soil. Is the sediment covering the prop roots? Is it covering the pneumatophores? Is it preventing that necessary gas exchange? Is it preventing the red mangroves from doing their salt exclusion? You know, what are we dealing with as far as actual buildup of sediment? And then also turbidity in the water column. So has the water quality changed as a result of all of this additional sediment kind of floating around and blocking sunlight in these areas? Topography then also kind of goes hand in hand with hydrology and sediment. You're looking at elevation changes. So did you have areas where there was a large amount of sediment that was washed away? Maybe mangroves were washed away. Maybe you've had new depressional wetland development. Maybe you had a mosquito ditch that is no longer a mosquito ditch. Maybe it's full of debris, and now you have a new area where the topography has changed. As Mike was talking about, the species composition in mangrove ecosystems is very dependent on minor changes in topography. So if you have a couple inches, it could significantly alter the types of species that you're seeing. And so more specifically, you know, when we start to think about what is kind of mild damage, moderate damage, extreme, and catastrophic, those are the 4 categories we're going to look for. If you're looking at a mangrove fringe and some of your observations are that there's minimal leaf loss, right? So there's some leaves down. There are some small branches broken, and maybe you know that there was some flooding, but it wasn't there for very long. It was pretty limited, right? Those are the observations that you've made. And so this would indicate kind of mild damage to the mangroves. And in most cases, you're not going to need to do anything other than potentially remove trash and debris, and then monitor. Right. And Armando is going to talk more about monitoring, and David's going to mention monitoring as well in their presentations. But I highly encourage you to rely on groups of well-trained volunteers to go out and do those monitoring tasks. It's been well proven in a number of different studies that the data collected by well-trained volunteers is viable, it's accurate. So I highly encourage you to use volunteers where you can. Oops. Moderate damage is going to look more like this. So you're going to see moderate defoliation. So this would be like if you're looking at a mangrove tree and you notice that at the ends of the branches, like all of the branches, at the ends of the branches, it's missing its leaves. Interior foliage may still be present, but all of that foliage at the ends of the branches is now missing. So you've got moderate defoliation, not complete defoliation, but moderate defoliation, small to medium branch breakage. So you have some maybe 2-inch branches, 3-inch branches that have broken, fallen down, lots of small branches down. You know that there was some minor flooding, maybe salt water was up on the propagules or the pneumatophores were inundated for a longer period of time. And you notice that there's sediment present in the water column. The turbidity of the water has changed. This would be moderate damage to the mangroves. And in this case, you know, removing trash and debris is going to be appropriate, right? Always. You'll notice in each of these levels of damage, removing trash and debris is a necessary and good step, right, for the health of the mangroves. You may need to do some minor branch trimming for navigation or health. So if you have large branches that have broken, but they're not fully off the tree, they are blocking maybe sunlight for some seedlings that are nearby, it would probably be good for that mangrove tree to go ahead and to trim that broken branch off and remove it from that situation so those smaller seedlings can have a better chance. Now, when we talk about trimming mangroves, remember that mangroves are protected by the 1996 Mangrove Trimming and Preservation Act. They are under a lot of scrutiny by many different municipalities. I know that there are several local counties that have received delegation of the state mangrove rule. And so it's going to be very important for you, if you are the leader of a volunteer organization, to reach out to those relevant organizations prior to doing any kind of significant trimming. Now, I know that there is a special dispensation for folks going out and kind of doing recovery efforts. If there are minor branches blocking a waterway and you need to access that waterway to remove debris, I think that it's reasonable for you to trim that. Now, as long as you are trimming in an appropriate manner, and you know, I can go on and on about proper pruning practices, but I think for those of you in the audience who are certified arborists, you understand what a good pruning cut is. Make sure that your tools are sharp, because a sharp tool is a safe tool, and follow all ANSI standards. You may also find that it's necessary to do some minor sediment removal. Now, minor sediment removal is mostly going to be with your hands, your hand tools, things like that. And again, David and Armando are going to talk more in depth about what other considerations you might have for sediment removal. Extreme damage is where we have major defoliation. This is the majority of the leaves on the mangroves have been lost. You have large branch loss. This is going to be 3 inches or larger, and you may have some stem failure, complete stem failure, or uprooting. So you might see a whole trunk broken in half, knocked over, or you might see a mangrove that has been completely uprooted and knocked over as well. Now, in an extreme event, you may still have some seedling survival, right? So you might have uprooted, knocked over, stem failure, defoliated, large mangroves, but you still have an active propagule bank. You still have seedlings that are established. And so they are worth monitoring to see if they survive. Major flooding would also be a characteristic of an extreme amount of damage to mangroves. As Mike was talking about, mangroves have these wonderful, amazing adaptations to living in salty environments. But if they are inundated by salt water for any extended period of time, it is going to damage them. And as with other trees, mangroves may not show that stress right away. It could take up to 2 years for a mangrove to die after it has been fully inundated in floodwaters, just like we see with hardwood trees in terrestrial environments, right? If you have significant flooding events, trees will be slow to show that damage. So that's why monitoring in these situations is so important. Also, if you have sediment visible on the roots, if you've got, just a lot of sediment, if you've got garbage, things just piled up on the roots, on the pneumatophores, blocking that gas exchange, that's going to be something that is characteristic of an extreme amount of damage. Now, what we would consider catastrophic damage, this is where you have major stem failure. So most, if not all, of the mangroves have been blown down, branches down, stems broken, uprooted. You have complete defoliation. There's no leaf remaining. Seedlings are gone. They're covered in sediment. They were washed away by flooding. They're underneath a boat. You have major sedimentation. So large amounts of sediment has been deposited in these areas. And then you also have new channels and hydrological shifts. So you see areas where we didn't have water before, now we have water, we have new depressional marshes, we have mosquito ditches that are full. These are examples of kind of catastrophic damage. And this is where mangroves are really going to need the majority of human help, right? And so the actions associated here, again, removing trash and debris, it's going to be necessary in these cases to remove that large tree debris, right? In order to facilitate successful establishment and germination of those seedlings, you're going to have to remove that large tree debris. This is really tricky in mangrove environments, and I know that David is going to talk more about this, but if you have to remove a mangrove that was 12 inches in diameter, right, you're going to need a chainsaw. So now you have to have a chainsaw out in a wet, mucky mangrove environment full of trash and debris. And so this is a dangerous situation for the person wielding the saw, and it can be a very tricky place to navigate and be safe. So making sure that you are comfortable and capable handling that kind of equipment in these situations is absolutely important. Removing and relocating sediment. I'm not going to get into what it takes to actually dispose of that sediment, but this may require things like dredging or hydroblasting, planting mangroves and companion species. Armando is going to talk about this when he talks about mangrove restoration and planting, but it may not always be necessary to plant mangroves if there's a seedling bank that's active nearby. But in order to regain that species composition, that structure, that complexity where you have, let's say, 5-year-old trees and 1-year-old trees and baby seedlings, right? You want to have that structure, that complexity in your environment. And so it may be necessary to do some planting and not just facilitate natural establishment. And then monitoring is going to be absolutely necessary in these situations as well. So here's an example. And I just want to kind of show you some real life examples. So this is taken from right here in Manatee County. This is Emerson Point Preserve. And this is after the storm. You can see that we have the majority of the leaves are remaining. So we have minor, if any, defoliation. We do have some large broken branches. There was a stem failure, but if you look really closely at that stem, that trunk that's laying on the ground, it was obviously a dead tree, a snag prior to the storm event. So you do have stem failure, but it's a snag. There's a lot of really healthy seedlings here. So in this case, this would be a mild amount of damage. We would identify this as mild damage. We know that there was no significant flooding in this area. There's been no sediment buildup. There's no changes in hydrology or topography. So this is mild damage. In this case, I would look around for some trash, and then I would let it do what it's going to do. And I'd come back and I'd check on it. So this is an example of what we would see for mild. Now, I like this example because it gives you an idea of the complexity of these systems when we start looking at these real world scenarios. Here you have an intact mangrove fringe, right? Obviously a trimmed and maintained fringe. You've got condos and stuff over here. So these have been impacted prior to the storm by humans in that they're being trimmed. Here you have now catastrophic level of damage, right? So these mangroves over here, they have, and you can see some minor defoliation, some small branch breakage. You do know, however, that there was some pretty significant flooding in this area. There may be some sediment deposition. And so I would say that these mangroves, even though they don't have a lot of branch breakage or defoliation, you're probably looking at more of a moderate level of damage to these mangroves. Now, the mangroves here that are underneath what I'm assuming is a house or a boat or something, I can't tell exactly what it is here, in these mangroves, this is catastrophic, right? You have human debris, sediment landed on top of mangroves, branches broken, completely defoliated. So the very first thing you're going to do in this case is you're going to remove that debris, and then you're going to assess. So just to kind of summarize, when you get out there to do these damage assessments, removing trash and debris is always going to be a recommended action, right? But assessing the damage might require you to do some sleuthing. You might need to look at historical aerials and other types of photos, maps, and previous data that's available. And I know that David is going to talk more about that as well. And so I'll let him get into the details. I definitely encourage, again, engage your volunteer groups to monitor for regrowth, particularly in those areas where you have mild mangrove damage. Take additional steps when necessary. Don't overload your organizational capacity, and assess and monitor, right? This is going to be an ongoing process. We're not going to see all of the damage that these mangroves are going to endure right now. Right now, we have to kind of stop the bleeding and then triage. There we go. We're triage right now, and then we get into the recovery after that. And so I think I see maybe that there were some questions in the chat box, but this is the end of my portion of this presentation, and I'll hand it over.
I have got one question from Jay Prentice that says, why would there be a need to remove organic debris, even large debris, from damaged mangrove fringes? Seems like more organic matter helps soil formation and develop soil structure.
Sure. Yes. So, and in most cases, when you have natural debris, you have natural leaf litter, right? It's going to add nutrients to the environment. And actually, a lot of that leaf litter forms the detritus that is the base for a lot of those food webs that exist within mangroves. But when you have extreme or catastrophic damage, what you're dealing with there is massive amounts of debris that are not going to break down in the amount of time that the soil is going to be able to incorporate them readily. You're going to have buildup on the roots, on top of pneumatophores, and more importantly, you're going to be preventing the successful germination and establishment of new seedlings. So if you have all of this very large scale debris blocking the ground, you're not giving those seedlings that might wash into that area and germinate, you're not giving them access to that space to do so. So you want to get that large debris out. I absolutely agree that, minor leaf litter and branches and things like that add to the whole system. But when you have 100 trees down, you're going to have to remove some of that.
That was great, Alyssa. Thanks.
All right.
Were any additional questions? I'm trying to give everybody as much time to type as possible. Nope. Jay Prentice had his question answered. I feel like I had questions, but I think it's something that David and Armando are going to cover in their presentation. So if everybody doesn't have any more questions, I think we'll just move ahead and see what questions may or may not arise at the end. Worst comes to worst, we end early.
Perfect.
The next person who will be speaking is David Outerbridge.
Hello, everyone. Alyssa, are you going to manage the slides? Yes, here we go. How's everybody doing today? One of the reasons for putting this on was because we were getting a lot of calls regarding mangroves after putting out some articles and being on the Marine Debris Task Force and the like. And we just wanted to provide some indications of the best ways to clean up and also connect all of you, because a lot of times we work in silos and as well-intentioned people, and nothing can have more impact, whether it be good or bad, than a group of well-intentioned individuals. So this is to help connect all of you together so that we can manage volunteer days and really think about all of this holistically, because all of these ecosystems are connected. And we are all connected in managing them. So if we can go on to the next slide, this is going to cover the volunteer management and considerations for cleaning the mangroves. So, we're going to look at the mangrove cleanup planning timeline. It's going to be a really paint by numbers, very slow process. And a lot of you may do this and manage volunteers on a regular basis. So I appreciate that some of this may be not new information to you. But we're going to go, when we go and we do the assessment, as Alyssa pointed out, assess the scale of the damage next. Sorry, I've got a lot of transitions and Alyssa's doing this for me. So we also have to evaluate the types of damage, the types of waste that are in there, what we might need to remove that waste, the environmental factors, and then also the site considerations, where the locations of things are, how we access them, how we get volunteers into those places, as well as how they are logistically within our counties and environments. Next, please. Yes, and also potential partners that may be contingent to that space or close by. Then we get into the planning phase. We think about logistics. Who are we going to get in there? Who are we going to work with? How are we going to do it? When are we going to do it? What's the, water quality, all of those other things that we're covering in the assessment. Keep going, Alyssa. And where we're going to do it. And then there's the actual volunteer day. All that time and effort goes into the planning, but it's also the best time to change plan and the least impactful, right? So we're going to do support training. We're going to make sure safety measures, and then also any measurement of what we're collecting, measurement of the space itself, because we're going to be accessing spaces. We may not be able to get large volunteer groups or large groups of people to measure the dynamics of an ecosystem. Then the post-assessment, we got to follow up with the volunteers, see if they had a rewarding experience, stay connected with them so they can stay connected to the ecosystem and the space, and we can hopefully get them more durationally to come back to the space. Next. Yep, and then do a secondary site evaluation. Sorry, it's all the transitions. Appreciate that. Okay. Yeah, so our assessment considerations, we've got to think about the location and the land ownership, who owns the land, and where the location of the cleanup is going to be had, where we access that location if we need parking, anything like that. Next. The number and types of volunteers. Are we going to have a lot of volunteers? Are we just going to have a select few that are well trained to go in and clean up this area? Next. The access and staging areas. Where we're going to take the waste, the timing of it. Are we going to have a whole day? Are we going to have a morning? The tools required, again, that's going to be based on the scale and the size of the waste, the scale and size of the problem, and what we want to accomplish on the day, and what the responsibilities of ourselves, other agencies, and the volunteers are going to be. And then we also have to look at management plans for the areas that we're going to be going in and doing volunteer days. Are there existing management plans? Are they current? Are they up to date? Is this going to change the management plan long term? Is this a good time to reevaluate the management plan for this area and consider this damage in the long-term management of the area? What kind of measurement do we want to get? What kind of measurement is pre-existing of this area? And what do we want to measure when we go in here? Do we want to measure the sediment? Do we want to measure the salinity? Do we want to measure nutrients in the soils? Do we want to look at specific trees and see if we can long-term find out the long-term impacts of hurricanes in this area and shifts in the environment? Next. Mapping. a really valuable tool that we all use on a regular basis, GIS mapping. We can use NDVI, different formats, and there's LiDAR maps of a lot of our coastal areas as well. So we can use that as a baseline. We want to evaluate the water quality. This is a hugely important one. We've got to monitor the water quality and see if we've got any algal blooms, any bacterial outbreaks, making sure that we have a safe environment for our volunteers. Next, water flow. Has there been any shifts in the water flow between pre-storm and post-storm? What is that going to change? Is that going to change how we manage the volunteer day, what we want to accomplish with the volunteer day? The types of waste in the area when you're going in and doing initial assessment. Is there large waste? Is there hazardous waste? Do we want to talk about sludge and removing of other maybe petrochemicals and other things that might affect the environment? What are we going to need to do that? The vegetative damage, as Alyssa covered before, are we going to have severe, significant? Are there a lot of trees down that we need to clear in order to gain access and long-term access? Are they blocking roots, either water roots or foot roots? And then contingent ecosystems. We're going in and we're cleaning up these mangroves, but that is going to have an effect on everything around those mangroves. So seagrass, if there's a lot of sediment, is going to affect that adversely, as well as upland habitats as well. If there's management going on in upland habitats, that's going to all come down as well. And the most important part, funding. Where are we going to get the money? Is it already existing? Are we going to need FEMA dollars, county dollars, state dollars? Where do we get the funding for that? And what kind of devices are there that exist out there? And again, we're providing a whole bunch of resources after this. I'm just covering this as a paint by numbers, how you consider going in. Next. So planning of the day itself. You want to think about the number of volunteers and the skill levels of those volunteers. How much time you have available to manage it, and what the short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals are. If you go in and just do a single day removing waste from the mangroves, it may impact the mangroves more adversely than just leaving that waste in there and allowing the mangroves to grow up around it. If you go in and continue it and monitor the mangroves and see how the damage is, it'll be better for the health of the mangroves. So it's key that we go in with that thought in mind. The priorities, continued engagement. Do we want to have some citizen science projects? Are there existing community groups that we can work with? And how many boats are we going to need? Because a lot of this is about removal of debris, and you are going to need to figure out a way to remove that debris and get it out safely. And who's going to manage that? Next. Distribution, how you're going to distribute your volunteers on the site. Individuals, small teams, or a large group. And it's also difficult to manage when you have a lot of individuals going into spaces. You can't monitor them if they're not properly trained. If you have small teams, you can have group leaders that monitor those groups. And if you're working in a large group, it's easier to manage and monitor that and get a big swath of things done in a very short time. Debris removal. So size type is sludge, garbage, boats, dead trees, and other unforeseen debris. Again, the other unforeseen, you never know what you're going to run into in there. So being properly prepared for it and training for it is best. The scale. So the areas of focus versus the areas of priority versus the areas of proximity. Where is it easy to get to? Where are the priorities, and what do you want to focus on? Do you want to focus on getting debris out? Do you want to focus on the health of the trees and cutting vegetation? The distance and movement. This is a huge one. Access, aggregation, and distribution of waste. Where you're going to access the waste, where you're going to aggregate it, and then where you're going to distribute it to get it out of the site. Post-collection, who are you going to be working with that post-collection? A lot of in Lee County, it's solid waste that's going to be managing a lot of that post-collection and dumpsters, but thinking about where that waste goes and what types of waste and how you have to separate the waste. Safety is probably paramount. What kind of safety equipment are you going to need? Gloves, footwear, suits, glasses, and collection tools. Are you going to need saws to cut up maybe large swaths of metal, and other things like that. What kind of equipment, boats, saws, cutting implements, the environment, further damage to mangroves, roosting wildlife. So it's going to be time of year, and timing is going to be important in that. Changes in water flow and distribution, sludge toxins, as well as tides. So contingency first aid, you've got weather, environmental monitoring, and, think about your alternatives. If you have a day planned and it's not ideal for weather or other things like that, and also monitoring the environment for algal blooms and bacterial. So, and finally, just to cut, because it's the Christmas season, this is a really great opportunity for good volunteer management. It's going to be focused initially on the outreach and communication, how you target, what email lists you use, and then the sign up and data collection of those volunteers so they can be continued volunteers with your organizations. Strategic and clear communication is a huge portion of that. A lot of volunteer organizations kind of lose people because they can keep that communication. They either over communicate or under communicate. There is a sweet spot for communication. So that's Buddy the Elf waving hi, nice to meet you. And then the next step is great training. If they're familiar with who you are and what you do, they have integrated learning as part of these volunteer days where they're learning about the ecosystems. They're building a connection with them. They're building a connection with each other and your organization. You are training a community, and that community is supporting you. And also representation and diversity. If we have the same people coming back as volunteers and it does not represent our communities, then it's going to be more difficult to help support these environments with people that are not familiar with it, or maybe in our communities that we don't usually get to. Clear goals. Everybody loves organizing, right? You should see the office that I'm in right now. It's not very well organized, but it drives me crazy. But so the clear goals, you've got to have a vision, a mission, a strategic plan, and really celebrate those successes when you get them. But if you don't have a vision or a mission or a strategic plan, you're kind of rudderless with all of this. And then follow up. This is another one. We have people out for a volunteer day and we don't necessarily always follow up because the work is done. It's going to help with retention of people. It's going to help with engaging the communities. And it's also going to help them and you with connection and well-being. It's also been proven that volunteerism actually builds well-being and builds community. And that is social capital, and that helps us support strong, healthy, resilient communities in storms like this. So that's it for me. If anybody has any questions, I know I just scratched the surface on a lot of these issues. I could go more depth, but I'll leave it off to Armando, and thank you for joining us for lunch.
Thank you, David. And I guess it's my turn now.
Oh, do you want me to jump in with questions, Armando?
Sure, sir. Go ahead.
Yes, we just really had one comment from James Niehaus. I'm sorry if I didn't get the pronunciation of your name quite correct, but his comment was to make sure that a first aid kit is a part of your safety consideration.
Yeah. So, and having somebody there that's first aid trained would really be helpful as well, because I've been out on volunteer days and had people cut themselves pretty badly, and having to call in ambulances and stuff. So definitely have an emergency management plan when you have volunteers out there.
And David did mention that we plan to send out some resources. As he mentioned, he just scratched the surface, and still all the considerations that are necessary to plan a day like this. And on top of that, there's a really large impacted area. The hosts here span a really large area, from Sarasota to Lee County. So we plan to send out in a follow-up a myriad of resources that will hopefully cover that area to help people, make decisions sort of in that decision tree that David outlined.
Yeah, and we're all available for consultation as well. If anybody would like, Alyssa, myself, and Armando do a regular mangrove regulation pruning training for any county staff and also private staff. And also, if you want any consultations on volunteer days and how to manage them or connect organizations, we're happy to help.
Absolutely. So I guess it's my time now. And thank you for staying. This is the end. We're not going to take too long. We just heard about how important, in case you're on a slave, but we basically heard from I hear from my colleagues about how important mangroves are, all the services they provide, right? And the issue we're facing with marine debris on them, stuck on them, and things how to assess the damage and how to clean up those areas. But let's say you did all the cleanup and now you have a plan, or you have a need for restoration, right? After storm. So what do you need to do? Next, please. First, the things I think Alyssa already mentioned this, and David as well. First things to consider is that mangroves might naturally recover by themselves. So basically, you might not have to do anything if there's recruitment in the area. So one of the things is like you might have time, to actually really assess, and you should put time into assess. You might not need to do restorations. It might be costly. There might be more damaging. So just think about this as well. Then another thing to consider is the recovery time, right? So not only can recruit themselves, yes. If not, but if yes, how long will it take, and what is what can be at stake for that? So basically, what are the risks of letting it naturally recover by themselves? Let's say it's late in this hurricane season, so you might have another hurricane, another storm coming next summer. Can you wait? Is your area prepared for that? So that's the thing that you have to look, right? What's the disturbance levels? What is the damage? And what is the urgency in that regard? And then you have to look at what type of mangrove restoration are you going to be doing, right? You're going to do planting. Are you going to have to stabilize the slope where the mangroves were? You remove a lot of debris, so now what do you have left? You have to bring sediments to the site. So there's a lot of things that you have to look into it, and I'll go some over it. And just like David said, this is we so much we can share with you. We have resources. I'm gonna give you links also to some courses that we have. So hopefully this will all help you in this process. Next, please. So the first, the number one step, I think, is to go after you do the assessment, right, of the damage. You also have to look at what are the chances for natural restoration. So look at your site and we'll look at what kind of stressors, what kind of disturbance your site still has, or might have had as a result of the storm. One of the ones is the invasive species. Normally, when you have a storm or a site, natural shoreline has been disturbed, you open it up for all these opportunistic species, invasive species that might colonize an area quicker than a native vegetation. In this case, in our area, we have a lot of Brazilian peppers, Australian pine, many others ones. So you have to make sure that you type of plants you have there, and then you can actually address those that might not allow for the mangroves to come back naturally or after you plant them. Another thing you have to look into it when you look at restoration is the flow of the water, right? Hydraulic might have changed. Things might be blocking how the water flows, and that's might be the source of fresh water or salt water, depending on what it is, where it's coming from. But you need to assess here. Here's in the picture, we have an area that got really affected by mangroves. It wasn't due to storm, it was more anthropogenic, but it created this, it still basically cut all the passage of water and flow that coming from all that area. So it's creating it changed the vegetation type. It was encroaching into the mangroves. So things like that is something you look into it. Next, please. Step number 2 is you have to do an evaluation of your site. You already did the site assessment, right, for damage and things like that. But now you need to look at the site to see what are conditions for you to do the restoration. David already pointed out the importance of maps. We all use them. Now everybody has access to beautiful, software that is free for use, like Google Earth and others, that you can have historical data as well. You can have images of an area that, you can go years back. So all that kind of information allows you to prepare and have a more successful restoration plan. The other things you need to look at, what is around the area. So you might not have those pictures, but you can see a few miles down where you are, or up, wherever you are, what kind of vegetation you have there. There's other tools and other stuff that you look at soil types and other things that, accessible and free for everybody. So you can use those. Another thing you need to look into is the hydrology, not just disturbance, like I was pointed out, like things blocking maybe the pathway of water, but you need to look at where water is coming from, the fetch. That's so how much water, open water you have for wind to pick up and to hit the shoreline, so that when you think about stabilization of a shoreline and thinking about what kind of materials you might have to use to help those mangroves get established before they can survive on their own. And then you have to see if the site is prepared, right, for planning. In this case, I have a picture of a bank that lost. I mean, this is basically a drop. So if you do want to do any kind of restoration there, you have to fill in and have like a more gentle slope. And just a reminder, when you start doing this kind of projects, you might have to be working in the water. You might be working with nearby ecosystem, might be protected as well, like seagrasses and things like that. So it's a lot of permitters that you have. Some of them might require, so checking with your local, obviously, authorities, and then, states as well, and reaching out to UC grants, agents, and other extension agent might be able to help you with this process, is to answer some of those questions. So always take that into account. Next, please. The next step is obtaining new mangroves. So let's say you did recognize that your area needs to be, you need to do some replanting, you need to replace some of those mangroves that were lost. So where do you get them from, right? Well, there's multiple sources. You can actually pick seedlings, well, not seedlings, you can pick propagules, I should say, from the natural environment. In some cases, you might need to, check with the local authorities or, public lands. You might have to ask permission from the department, to control those lands, but normally you could do so. And so in this example here, like you can see these propagules laying on the sand. I like them floating in the water. I think it looks cooler, but don't ever pick them up from the tree. That's something that's totally illegal. Like we pointed out before, these trees are protected and they're regulated, so you cannot do that. You can also start like in advance, right? This tree grows slow, so you can have a school project or a volunteer day just to pick up some propagules, start growing them on your own, properties to be planted in the near future. And that's something that, in fact, if you're gonna request plants for a nursery, so you have to take into account that they might actually sell you the plants, but they won't give it to you until months later because they're actually making sure the plants are healthy and large enough to be planted, outside whatever container they are being grown at the moment. So there's a lot of ways that you can go about this, and that's the importance of, taking into account that it's going to take time. Another thing that to consider is extremely important is where you're getting your mangroves. So let's say you actually have a nursery that has mangroves. You might not want to go to a nursery that's like way far from where you are, because you want to kind of maintain the genetic, diversity of the area. So you want to maintain the genetic diversity. So you want to be mixing mangroves, even though the same species, you might want to be using, local sources. Next, please. The step number 4, I think, will be the planting. So now you have acquired your plants, you already have your 3 species of mangroves, you already decided where you're going to use them. So how do you do this? So one thing to consider always is the size of the plants. Normally you put the bigger plants out front, so more closer to the water, and you put the smaller plants behind, so where they're more protected. There's multiple ways to do this to make sure that your project is successful in terms of plants surviving. And there's different techniques. Some of them will learn, to trial errors. Alyssa already mentioned the Nature Conservancy document. That's just going to provide a link. There's some information about that. I'm going to provide you more information at the end in another couple slides down the road, that courses that you can take. But it varies, right? But normally it's that you don't want to be planting isolated or individual plants by themselves. You kind of want to protect them. Some instance, you might want to use certain erosion control techniques, like in this case, we have the coconut coils in this picture to create a more gentle slope, right? Then you have this prism rift, which are oyster recruiting rift. These ones are, we have been using them for quite a while. They're very successful, and you have multiples. There's multiple things, but one thing to consider is that a lot of these things will require permits, either state or federal government. And also things to consider is try to use materials that are more environmental friendly. So try to stay away from plastic and things like that if you can, obviously. So there's a lot of different techniques. All the things to consider is all the plants that you might want to put in the area as well. Like Michael was saying at the beginning, bottomwood. We don't consider a mangrove, but it's associated with mangrove fringes. So you can use bottomwood as well. And in salt marshes, right? You have a lot of marshes. In fact, we have done a lot of planting that we put marshes around the mangroves that we planted to help them protect, to create a little cluster, so they're a little bit more resilient when it comes to tide moving in and waves impact and things like that. Next, please. The step number 5, I think it will be monitoring your site. So you already do the planting. You have to take into account that some of the plants won't survive. So you have to do some replacement. So knowing how many plants you planted in, sometimes if your area is not too big, you can individually mark them. So that way you can actually monitor individual trees. That's a great way to do this. How often do you have to do this? Well, it really depends. At the very beginning, it will be like monthly, sometimes more than once a month for at least the first 3 months to make sure that these mangroves are establishing. Then you might want to move it by, every quarter, and then, once a year. But it really depends of the site and the scale, obviously, but you have to have some monitoring plan in place to make it sure that you are being successful in your restoration plans. One thing that is pretty obvious, but a lot of people sometimes don't think about it, is pictures. having pictures from a particular specific point, that you take the picture or more than one picture from the same spot, same elevation. It will give you a really good perspective in your success or your failures of your project. Other things that you can look at is the volume of the canopy. So basically how many leaves each tree is putting out there up to a certain point, right? I mean, once you know it's successful, it's when you have too much to count. So at that point, you might don't want to keep doing that, but it's a really good way to keep monitoring for your site and success. Next slide, please. This is, my last slide. Like I said, it's going to be short, not too long, but I don't want to keep you very too long, but we're looking forward to having a conversation and talking and answer questions from you. But basically, we have three major opportunities. There's other ones, but these are the ones that we all involve in one way or another. But one of them is the Living Shoreline Training for Marine Contractors course. It's already been out there. This is a partnership between FWC, Sea Grant, and other agencies. Now we're going to be offering this course. It's not just for marine contractors. When it was landscapers, marine landscape architects, all kind of stuff. But it's more in depth. It's covered not just mangroves, cover all living shorelines, and it's going to be. Next year, we're going to be offering this in 12 different cities and 12 different watersheds around the state. So keep an eye for that. We also have the Florida Math and Naturals program, Coastal Restoration, special topic course. This is taught pretty much almost in every county, coastal county, and the state. So you don't have to wait for to be offered in your county. You can look maybe in one nearby. This is a really good one because it actually teaches some of the stuff that I just cover. In fact, some of the material, some of the information I got it from here. I teach this course as well, and it's more like hands-on. We go into the field and actually assess, measure the distance of these mangroves. Like I said, you want to have, the larger plants are the better, the most likely will survive. But there's different techniques in terms of spacing and distance based on the height of the plants. So things you need to consider. So taking these courses will help you with that. And then David already mentioned, but we teach the Mangrove Best Management Practice course. And this is, we can come to you, we can help you. If you have already a group of people that want to take this, we'll do this. And we offer them openly as well. So we have a lot of resources for you to help you with it. And like David said, we more than help you. If you have already a plan to conduct a volunteer, restoration work, we're happy to come and assess it and help you as well with that. Next, I think that was my last slide, so I'm not sure if I have another one. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Armando. This is our last slide, but before people start to scurry on out, we did want to mention that there's going to be a post survey that we are going to put in the chat here. Actually, I will start it right now so that you guys have as much time as possible, but particularly those of us that are in attendance for that are trying to earn their CEUs, there's a question in this survey that takes your certification number so that you can get those CEUs. So if you would please fill that out so that you can we can get you the information you need. And then we do have a couple questions based on your presentation, Armando. I'm just trying to scroll up to find them. There is one from Vinson. It says, have water quality conditions after Ian prevented people from engaging in cleanup efforts?
Yes. No, to me, I'm going to speak for my own, experience. Not with mangrove stuff, and this is something good when you're going to plan an event. Have a backup date. So right now we're dealing with red tide in some areas around here. So I have had events that I have to move just because, more like a beach cleanup and things like that, or underwater cleanup, just because we have red tide and things like that. So you don't want to expose your volunteers to things like that. So water quality will be an issue. There's some areas that have been impacted, and so that's monitored. The good thing is that there's tools and there's sites that you can go and check for water quality. So that's something that you might not have to do yourself, but I'll let all the ones answer as well. That's a really good question.
I can speak for Charlotte County here, where we've got red tide sort of drifting into some areas of our county. I think up until this point, while water quality conditions are certainly something that you should consider, particularly for future events, I think honestly it's a timing thing. It's only been 2 or 3 months since the hurricane. I'm trying to do the quick math in my head. About 2 months since the hurricane hit, and there was a recovery period. FWC won't even touch sort of a derelict vessel until the owner of that boat has been given the opportunity to claim it, which a fair amount of these are in mangroves for a little while. there was sort of the general consensus that you should stay out of the water because nobody really quite knew what was going on. So I think the answer is yes. And also there are just some logistics that have prevented it from happening up until this point. But something that is people might not have thought of is that, you know, all of these restoration and cleanup efforts can occur very far into the future. They don't have to be an immediate action because it's something that will take all of our counties a little while to recover from. So there's no time frame on it.
I'm gonna say something really quickly, and I don't know, David, if you're waiting, and I just got you your time. But I think it's important to remember, you know, if you're gonna be working in mangroves areas, you're gonna be working in oysters, you're gonna have sticks poking out. So there's already some hazard things that they're natural hazards, and you have to take into account, you know, each individual. So like David said, and I think somebody from the audience reminded about having that safety kit and all this stuff. So you have to really anticipate for the worst. So obviously have a plan for that, and everybody will react differently. So, but just a lot of things to think of it. But don't be, obviously, you know, this shouldn't deter you from trying to do good and trying to make this happen. It's just about what have you planned to minimize risk.
Yeah, I think in Lee, we're waiting till next year, mainly because, you know, of all the other cleanups, but also just so that a lot of, if there is anything in the water, that it dissipates by the spring, and we can do it a bit more safely. So I think in Lee County, we are waiting a little bit till next year.
You made it, Kate.
Sorry, guys. We do have a couple more questions going on. We've got one from Cutter Hammond. He asked, have there been any studies or assessments done on the expansion of mangroves into the panhandle counties? Black mangroves have appeared in several counties along the Gulf Coast, and red mangrove props have started washing ashore as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We have people tracking that, and panhandle up on the East Coast, up past Jacksonville area, all the way up into South Georgia, we're seeing black mangroves in those areas. So yes, absolutely. And yes, there is somebody who's tracking that as well. As Michael indicated, it's a really interesting situation because of the displacement of salt marsh ecosystems, right? So you have one halophytic species kind of, you know, encroaching on another native halophytic species, which both species provide a wealth of ecosystem services for their respective geographies. So it's an interesting issue for sure. And Armando's got his hand raised.
Yeah, but I'll wait if somebody else wants to talk about that. I was gonna change subjects a little bit quickly before I forget something that I was thinking about it when you were presenting.
I just mentioned during my talk that the black mangroves are one of the more thermally tolerant of the lower temperatures of the species, while that red mangrove, that propagule viability is good for almost over a year. So that is the dispersal of that kind of one. But really the black mangroves were the naturally occurring ones first.
All right. Well, I hope that answered the question. But yeah, you will see this is gonna be we're gonna be seeing more mangroves, obviously, probably moving up north. One thing that I wanted to remind people is that if you're gonna do a cleaning of a mangrove area, if you have a dead mangrove, those are protected as well. So if it is, you know, woody debris, you need to make sure that you know what woody debris you're talking about, because you might create more damage. And then again, they are protected. So there's just if you have questions, just reach out.
Yeah, it's something I would mention too. You know, in the trimming and maintenance best practices class that we teach, you know, we engage with the local arboriculture industry, and we've learned some best practices from folks who are routinely trimming in mangroves on how to kind of protect prop roots and pneumatophores. And so there are some considerations when you're doing debris removal, right? It's good to get that stuff off of there, but you don't want to also be tramping around all over on top of the pneumatophores, breaking them, breaking prop roots. Red mangroves have fairly thin bark. And so if you're wearing any kind of, you know, heavy protective footwear, you can tear the bark really easily when you're stepping on the prop roots. So thinking about ways that you can minimize that impact. And I know some arborists will set up like small small ladders with kind of like 2x8s on them, so that they can kind of create little planks to walk around on and navigate a little bit more easily, so they're not impacting the mangroves quite as much.
Excellent. Cool. Thanks, guys. We have one question from James Niehaus, who was curious as to how he was going to be able to access the recording of the webinar. I mentioned in those follow-up materials, we're going to include the link to the recording along with some of those other resources. Our next question was from Michel Ambler. Again, I apologize for the pronunciation. How do you determine whether debris should be removed, left, or left? And they're specifically thinking of Lover's Key. He also has a second question, but I'm fairly certain they're unrelated.
What was the question? Sorry. When the tree has.
How do you determine whether debris should be removed or left?
Is it anthropogenic? Is it horticultural waste?
So is it like big trees down, or is it a boat?
Yeah.
But let's go into it. I mean, I guess it's the type of debris, right? And how long it's been there.
They say it's a boat.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So for human debris, right? If it's the size of a boat, ideally, somebody's going to come along eventually and get that derelict vessel out of there. It's going to be better for the mangroves if they do so, because you're going to be able to have seedlings grow and all of that. Now, in the removal of that boat, there is the possibility for damage to the mangroves, right? You're going in there, you're hauling it out. Potentially there might be a crane necessary. And so this can be a pretty destructive act for the mangroves. So and again, this all goes down to kind of monitoring and assessment. If you see successful seedling establishment, if you see complexity of form and structure, if you see habitat development, and you think that the removal of that debris is going to negatively impact all of those things, then I would consider leaving it in place, as long as it's not also contributing to human health hazards. So if it's a boat that is also like leaking something, or anything that could be hazardous for health, you would want to remove that right away. But in general, again, it comes down to that monitoring and assessment. At least I think so. But maybe my colleagues have something else to say.
I just want to say that. Go ahead.
Armando. I was going to say, just make sure if it does stay out there for a long time, maybe draining the gas and the oil, so it doesn't get into the environment if it hasn't already leaked, and looking if there's any other pollutants on there that may affect the mangroves adversely. A boat sitting in there is going to be a lot less intrusive than something liquid that can get through the mangroves.
Mm-hmm.
Check with your agencies. Obviously, contact FWC. Contact your local, counties and ask for help, and then we can guide you through the process. But yeah, boats have to be lifted, so you cannot cut the mangroves to get a boat out. So that's against the law. So there's different type. Again, it comes to the type and what is the immediate need and urgency to remove certain things, and that's what this is, case by case, and that's something that you cannot, just do. This is the procedure because it will vary. So you have to use your best judgment for that, and get the support that you need.
Yep. I had a question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, if it's actively creating some sort of habitat destruction too, that's sort of under the FDP umbrella as well, where they would identify it and it would go on the upper portion of the list for removal. So, look for those leaking kind of vessels and stuff, and those are the ones that we need to get out of the mangroves quicker. They might have already leaked already, considering they've been in the mangroves for 50 or more days. But even, during new rain events, super high tides, we might experience some more of those runoff kind of conditions where pollutants could have been dried up or uplands, but now are mobile and starting to go towards our base.
Yeah, I wanted to share, Kate, somebody sent me a question directly, and it was related to testing water quality for Vibrio. would be a good preventative for personal safety. I don't know if there are any kind of quick tests for Vibrio, but if you're planning a volunteer event and you have the capacity within your organization to test water quality for microorganisms, for algae, I think that would definitely be a good preventative measure. And also remembering that, you know, Vibrio gets into your body if you get injured. So managing your volunteer event in a way to minimize injury is going to be absolutely necessary.
I can speak to that as well, since I have been sort of privy to some of the water quality monitoring efforts. I think sort of the Vibrio has been added to the list, but again, that'll be something that we'll include in the resources. Is there are a lot of programs out there for monitoring coastal environments for all sorts of bacteria, as well as the Vibrio Department of Health page that sort of helps sort of track what's going on. And I wanted to note that Dr. Jen McGee also put in a message that she works with FWC, and she says, we also have trained natural resource advisors that are activated in post-storm situations to assess debris removal impacts and provide guidance and recommendations for removals. So Jen, I would advise you maybe to go put your information in the Jamboard so that folks can see it and interact with you and contact you directly if they were interested. Oh, she says not sure how to post on this Jamboard or to the larger group. I can help you with that when we move on to our next question here. Michelle actually had another question as well. She said, has any specific amount, I'm assuming she's referring to funding here, from hurricane relief been allocated to mangrove restoration from Hurricane Ian? Does anybody know of that offhand?
I think they're still in the evaluation phase from everybody that I've spoken to, and long-term planning, because they're planning it along with coastal restoration and future mitigation. So FEMA's looking not only at removing the debris, but also, you know, planting of shellfish, mangroves, seagrasses, and other things like that for natural mitigation methods for future storms.
And I think there was some funding already from previous storms. They were already working in restoring sites. So this is, again, take time, unfortunately. And that's the part that, you know, that depending on disturbance level, magnitude, then it takes a little bit. Yeah, so they're saying we're cleaning up. We're in this planning processes, kind of evaluating. So I'm sure it will be, but not, yeah, in the making.
I'm looking, we've got a whole conversation going here. So I'm just trying to keep everything nice and tidy as best we can.
But I'm going to say something though. They are already at grants that, sorry for interrupting, there's grants already and things like that communities can apply to. They were not related to hurricanes, but they're related to, you know, improving coastal shorelines, restoring habitat and things like that they come, you know, from multiple agencies frequently. So if you're interested in finding resources to enhance an area, to do work, reach out as well. Maybe we can point it out. And then, yeah, I'm sure you're kind of related. There will be funding for that as well. But there's already existing funding for some of this work that can be, you know, utilized to enhance coastal properties, coastal shorelines.
Peter Monty asked if the mangrove best practices class is going to be offered in Collier or Lee County.
It was scheduled for tomorrow in Matanzas, but we postponed it to the new year. So we're probably going to have it early, probably in February or March.
And where do people go, David, to find out about our class, you know?
Well, I have everybody's contact information, so we'll be distributed to the group that attended today, so they will have that information.
But if you go to Eventbrite too, we post our Eventbrite's event sometimes there too, and you know, by different counties. So you might have to go into the Eventbrite for the different counties. But yeah, if you do a quick search, it might show up there too. But yeah, we'll reach out.
So Robin Leach asked, is the identification of invasive species, should you include that in your surveys?
Yes, absolutely. And as Armando mentioned, you know, when you have an area where you have some catastrophic removal of mangroves, right, the opportunity is now ripe for invasive species seedlings to germinate in that area. So if there's a nearby seed bank of Brazilian pepper, Australian pine, carrot wood, something that can survive in that kind of saline environment, those intertidal areas, it's going to be really important to be able to identify those invasive species. And you know, if you want to incorporate that as part of your volunteer day, not just removing debris, but also going out and removing invasive species, that would be great.
Just scrolling through here, making sure that we are reaching everybody. It seems like Mike has posted some resources in the chat. Like I mentioned, we are going to share those with everybody afterwards as well. So you have a more stable location to find them when you are ready. John Hutchinson asked, as a part of a local cleanup effort in Charlotte County, how would dumpsters be resourced? That's a really good question, John. I'm not sure.
Again, we just scratched the surface on that because it's different from municipality to county, but in Lee County, it's solid waste. Lee County Solid Waste would be handling that. So I would reach out to them directly and saying you're doing a post-storm debris cleanup and start there.
Yeah, and
Second,
yeah, whatever municipality you're in, I would start with your kind of waste management department in that municipality, reach out to somebody there, and then they would be able to assist you with that.
And if for some reason you reach any roadblocks, John, you have my email here and I could see what I can do from the local government side to help you out. Oh, Rhonda Harvey, who is with Keep Charlotte Beautiful, said that you could also reach out to her. So that is Keep Charlotte Beautiful, all phonetic and stuff. Oh, yep, Mike beat me to the link. Thanks, Mike. I also want to note that there was a typo in Dr. Jen McGee's email for her marine debris email here. There is no dot. It's not marine debris at my FWC. So I'm just going to post the correct link. And I will also go ahead, since the questions have slowed down a little bit, I'm going to repost and reiterate how useful that exit or answering that exit survey is going to be to us, and particularly for those who are looking to earn credit for their participation today for CEUs. And since we don't have any more questions, like I said, you have not probably not seen The Last of Us, so feel free to use the contact information that has been up for a little while to reach out to any of us. And if we can't come and help you directly with some sort of consultation, we will do our best to help you find the people who can. So thanks everybody for your time, and hopefully we get you a little time back on your lunch.
Thank you for attending.
Thank you, everyone.